Today I'm with Einat Wilf, an intellectual, a former member of the Knesset.
The tragedy of the Palestinians is that whereas other Arab countries in the region have their own separate identity, have their own history, the Palestinians, as their name suggests, have been constructed only around the negation of Zionism, only around the resistance to a Jewish state. The Palestinian demand death to Israel. They've learned to say it in words like justice and rights, but fundamentally, if you ask them, I, over 20 years, have found 3 Palestinians who are publicly willing to say that they want to live next to the Jewish state with all the implications. 3, the Palestinian flag is the new red flag. Queers for Palestine. Palestine is about climate change. Palestine is about fighting capitalism. Palestine is about indigenous movement, because it has become the new red flag of utopia.
My name is Stefan Thompson. I'm the founder of Visegrad24, and I'm here in Israel, in Tel Aviv, on the ground, interviewing a series of politicians, intellectuals, and experts around the Israel-Hamas war and the broader problems of the region, and also about the role that Israel plays in the broader West. And today I'm with Einat Wilf, an intellectual, a former member of the Knesset, and an expert on the Israel-Hamas, Israel-Palestine, Israel-Palestinian conflict, struggle, and broader clash. And this is what I want to ask you, is the first question, Einat, is what is the war that is actually being fought now?
So the war that is being fought now is not the war in Gaza. The war in Gaza is merely the current arena in the bigger war. And the bigger war has been the same war for the last century. It's the war that the Arab world, and especially the Arabs of this area, now known as Palestinians, have been waging for the total purpose of no sovereign Jewish state anywhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Everything else has just been instances of that, symptoms of that, but the war is waged for one purpose and one purpose only, so that the Jews will not be sovereign anywhere in this land. The reason that right now there's a war going on in Gaza is because Israel withdrew from Gaza. The Palestinians, for the first time in their history, the Arabs of the Levant, had territory that they actually controlled. Contrary to these fake maps of losing Palestinian territory, when Israel withdraws from the Gaza Strip, it's the first time that the Arabs of the Levant, the Palestinians, control territory. And rather than say to themselves, wonderful, Gaza is a beautiful strip of land, it sits on a gorgeous beach, it's at the crossroads of 2 ancient trade routes, we're going to turn this into the Dubai of the Levant, the Singapore of the Middle East. True to their ultimate purpose, they say, excellent. We're going to use Gaza to weaponize the entire urban landscape of Gaza in order to turn it into a highly fortified machine for the purpose of, in their view, liberating Palestine from the river to the sea. So the reason that we have an arena in Gaza right now is that the Arabs have been using Gaza in order to continue the same war that they have been waging for the last century, initially to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state, and when they fail to achieve that, to basically undo it.
But what the Palestinians, or the Arabs of the Levant, as you call them, would argue is that if only they were given a state, if only they were given sovereignty and self-determination, the same way that Jews have been given sovereignty and self-determination on the land of Israel, none of this would happen. What do you say to that?
So one of the things that mark the way that the conflict is often told is a complete reversal of cause and effect. The reason that Palestinians don't have a state is that they actually never pursued a state. Whenever they faced a choice, and they faced multiple choices in the last century, whenever they faced a choice that they could have their own state, but the Jews will also have their state next to them, every time They rejected that opportunity and they went to war, very violent and brutal one typically. Often when I look at the history of the conflict, I bring a quote. It's a quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. He was not a friend to the Jewish people, certainly not to those who wanted sovereignty. And he goes to the British Parliament in February of 1947 to explain why Britain failed to fulfill the mandate that it received unanimously from the League of Nations when the Ottoman Empire collapsed to help the Jews achieve sovereignty in the land. It did not betray the Arabs. It created Jordan, Syria. France helped create Syria and Lebanon. Britain helped create Jordan and Iraq. But there's no state for the Jews. And he needs to explain why. Britain is basically giving the mandate back to the United Nations, the heir of the League of Nations. And he says the following: "We failed because His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict." He calls it irreconcilable. Now, this is February 1947. There's no occupation, there's no settlement, there's no blockade of Gaza, there's no Bibi, there's no right-wing government, there's no state of Israel for that matter. So all the things that we are told are the causes of Palestinian violence don't exist yet. And he already calls the conflict irreconcilable. And he goes on to explain. He says, in this land we have Jews and Arabs. No one is yet called a Palestinian. He says, for the Jews, the top priority, he calls it the point of principle, is to establish Jewish sovereignty in the land. So the Jews want to establish a sovereign Jewish state, exercising the universal principle of self-determination for the Jewish people in their ancient homeland. Very well, the Jews want a state. And then he goes on to say, and for the Arabs, the top priority, and these are the Arabs that will later be known as Palestinians. He says, for the Arabs, the top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. He's not saying the Jews want a state, the Arabs want a state. We just need the UN to help us divide the land. That would work with the idea that all the Arabs ever wanted is sovereignty and statehood. But he's saying something very different. He's saying, as a matter of top priority, the Jews want a state, and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. By definition, irreconcilable. This is why when the United Nations proposes several months later, divide the land. The Jews will have a state in the lands that the Jews reclaimed from malaria and the desert. The Arabs will have a state. The Jews say, sure, we're not happy. We were offered more than that, but we'll take it because our top priority is a sovereign Jewish state. And the Arabs say, absolutely not. We're going to go to war, and we're rejecting this plan for partition, which would have given the Arabs of the Levant, the Palestinians, their own Arab sovereign state. They're saying, we reject it, and we're going to go to war because our top priority, and they say that, our top priority is for the Jews not to have a state in any part of the land. That's our top priority. And this has only ever been the choice and the conflict. Every time that the Arabs were given a choice, you can have your own state, self-determination, dignity, self-governance, freedom, but it will mean that you live next to the Jews who will also have their state. Every single time, from 37 to 47 to 67 to 2000 to 2008, every time that they were faced with a clear and concrete choice to have an Arab-Palestinian state in part of the land next to a Jewish state, every time they reject that choice and go to war.
You call what is the people who are referred to by pro-Palestine circles as Palestinians, you insist on calling them Arabs. You don't seem to use the term Palestinians. Why is that?
I also use the term Palestinians, but a few words about where this name comes from. Not a lot of people know that when the mandate for Palestine is established in the wake of World War I, there's a series of mandates to help Arabs, Jews, Kurds, Armenians, Turks to establish states. That's the idea. The empire is gone, and now the people of the empire will have self-determination, and the British and French will serve as kind of interim tutors for that process. So there's quite a few mandates, and there's a mandate for Palestine. And the mandate for Palestine includes the following words: recognizing the historical connection between the Jewish people with Palestine. The Jewish people with Palestine, a historical connection? Well, 100 years ago, everybody knew, and this was unanimously adopted by the League of Nations, the body that represents the global goodwill after World War I. So this is a unanimous decision to recognize the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine. Because 100 years ago, everyone understood that the word Palestine was merely the Christian, Roman, colonial name given to the geography where the Jewish kingdom once stood and where the Jews will once again have their state. Because the mandate continues to use this language, and it's the only mandate that uses the following language. Based on the historical connection, this is the grounds for the reconstituting of the Jewish homeland in the land. So the world understands that the Jews establishing a state in Palestine is the reconstitution of an ancient homeland. It is globally understood that the Jews are not foreigners, not colonialists, not interlopers, that they have a historical, deep, continuous connection with one land and one land only. We call it the land of Israel, but the Roman colonial European name, since Emperor Adrian, is Palestine. Now, when the colonizers finally leave, when the British Empire is finally gone, the Ottoman Empire is gone, the Roman Empire is gone, the Islamic empires are gone, and the British Empire is finally gone, the Jewish people do what every self-respecting people did at this moment of decolonization around the world. They called themselves by their ancient name, right? The Gold Coast becomes Ghana. So we call ourselves, finally we can throw off the name Palestine, which was a foreign name, and we call ourselves by our name, Israel. Now what happens is this. The Arabs of the land have failed to achieve their goal of no Jewish state, right? That was their ultimate priority. No Jewish sovereignty, resisted the last, any Jewish sovereignty, any part of the land. They failed. The Jews are able to withstand the Arab onslaught, declare independence, and call themselves by their indigenous historical name, Israel. So now the Arabs of the land, some of them became refugees as a result of the war, some just remain in place. They now are looking for a name that will reflect their war. And they increasingly take the name Palestine. Because what they want to convey, they basically hijack the name in order to use the historical connection, because once everyone knew that Palestine was the historical connection with the Jewish people. So now they hijack the name Palestine in order to give it the impression that it's an exclusively Arab name, and they increasingly call themselves Palestinians. So the reason actually that I do use the name Palestinians and also the Arabs of the Levant and the Palestine Arabs is that the name Palestinians actually reflects the hijacking and the desire to erase the Jewish connection with the land. Sometimes I say that the day that the Palestinians will end their century-long war against Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land, they will probably no longer be called Palestinians. They will probably adopt a different name, a name that is not about erasing another people, but about something that is for themselves.
Do you think that there is a possibility of peace between Israelis and Arabs? And to what extent are the Abraham Accords a success and a milestone in achieving that?
I always believe in the possibility of peace. Looking at history, people change, ideas change, nations change. So the possibility always exists. But for the possibility to be realized, certain ideas have to die and new ideas have to be born. The idea that has to die is that to be an Arab and a Muslim is necessarily to oppose Jewish self-determination. Now, there's a long history of how Arabs and Muslims view Jews. Sometimes when I explain the conflict and people finally understand that it's only ever been about an opposition to a Jewish state, many people ask, then why? Why this century-long obsession with the Jews not being sovereign even in a tiny piece of land? Right? Because if the Jews would have received their fair share of the lands of the Ottoman Empire based on their population of the empire, Israel would have been 5 times the size of what it is today. So where is this opposition to the Jews not being sovereign even in a tiny sliver of their ancestral homeland? And that goes back to history. When the Arabs conquer the Levant and North Africa and the Middle East, the Jews have already been exiled, dispossessed for about 6 centuries. So when the Arabs come conquering, they only find one kind of Jew: weak, dispossessed, stateless, in exile. And as far as they're concerned, this becomes the way things are. And they incorporate it into their theology and their sociology. The Jews in the Arab and Islamic understanding are a people of lower status. They're never the equals of Arabs and Muslims, but they're also not complete infidels. I sometimes joke that they got the first book right, but not the sequels. So, we're going to give them this like middle lower status. Now, over the centuries, there were a lot of things that marked the Jews as being of lower status to the Arabs and Muslims. But my 2 favorite examples is that Jews could not ride horses. Horses were a mark of dignity. They were a weapon of war. Jews could only ride donkeys. And of course, they could not carry arms because their status that was called dhimmi meant that they were protected by the Arab and Muslim ruler. Sometimes they were more protected, sometimes less, but they could not defend themselves. Now, when you look at the early images of the Jews who are in Israel inspired by Zionism, inspired by the idea of self-determination, what are the 2 things you immediately see in those images? Jews are riding horses and they carry arms. Now imagine the theological, sociological, historical shock to the Arab and Muslim system in seeing those kinds of Jews. The instinctive response is almost violence. Go back to your place. This is not natural. This is not normal. So for a very long time, and the Arab-Palestinian struggle is part of that, it's the struggle to put the Jews back in their place. This is the opposition to Jewish sovereignty. Wait a moment here. You're not our equals. You do not get to defend yourselves. That's our prerogative. Now, what the Abraham Accords have started doing is to break the mold. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the countries that are normalizing relations with Israel, or talking about it, are the more successful Arab countries. Because ultimately, an obsession with Jews, with anti-Zionism, with anti-Semitism, is the mark of failed societies. It's the mark of societies that need someone to blame for their failings, to show, look, it's because of them. Because of Zionism, the Arab world is not where it should be. Now, it's not a coincidence that the successful Arab countries are no longer in need of this obsession with anti-Zionism to deflect away from their failings, because they're no longer failing. So they are able to develop an Arab and Muslim identity that is proud, that is future-looking, and is not obsessed with Jews. When the Abraham Accords were signed, I co-wrote an op-ed with 2 young Emiratis, a man and a woman. And it opens as follows. we're proud Arabs, we're proud Muslims, and we're Zionists. And they basically wrote and they said, there's no contradiction between a proud Arab and Muslim identity and the recognition that the Jewish people have a historical connection to the land of Israel and that they have the right to govern themselves by themselves in that land. So for me, the future, I sometimes call it Arab Zionism or Islamic Zionism, it is the Arab and Islamic proud embrace of the Jewish right to self-determination. So this is my long-term vision. Sometimes I call myself a long-term peace activist, and I genuinely believe that it's possible, however long it takes. The tragedy of the Palestinians is that whereas other Arab countries in the region have their own separate identity, have their own history, the Palestinians, as their name suggests, have been constructed only around the negation of Zionism, only around the resistance to a Jewish state. And there the challenge is much higher because they don't only need to kind of throw away anti-Zionism, they need to construct a new identity, Arab, Muslim, Levantine, that is not obsessed with the non-existence of a Jewish state.
There is one exception to successful Arab countries. Qatar is immensely wealthy. It's a very small but very gas-rich nation. Its people have done phenomenally well. They're also exceptionally talented. We see that with the PR operations that they run, be it in whitewashing their own crimes, or be it in influence operations under Al Jazeera or AJ+. And yet they are virulently anti-Semitic.
Yes. Qatar has made a mistake. I don't know to what extent Qatar is really a country. It seems to be a kind of terrorist group with a bank account, a very big bank account, which they use very effectively. But you're absolutely right. Qatar has taken the direction of thinking that they will protect themselves and save themselves by adopting anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and spreading it to the world. Al Jazeera, in Arabic and English, exists for the sole purpose of kind of inserting this poison around the world. And ultimately, this causes tremendous damage to Israel and the Jewish people, no question about that. But ultimately,
But not just the Jewish people. I mean, the fascinating thing about this is that Al Jazeera and AJ+ are also inflicting incredible damage on Western societies.
Precisely. So every society that was infected with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism sees the same process happening. First, if it's not fought against, there are no Jews left in that society. The Arab world, from Morocco to Afghanistan, in the 2 decades when Arab anti-Zionism was at its height in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, during those 2 decades, from Morocco to Afghanistan, no Jews are left. And we're talking about a complete ethnic cleansing of communities that in many cases predated the Arab and Islamic conquests. The Jewish community in Iraq went back to the Babylonian exile, and then but yet within a few years, it's gone. So the first thing that happens is that the environment turns hostile to Jewish life. But ultimately, you're right, the society itself becomes sick and sometimes collapses. You cannot look at any society in the world that made anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism a central feature of its ideology, of its construction, and somehow it was a good, thriving, flourishing society. I recently gave a talk to members of the American Congress who were visiting Israel. And I told them, look, you think that you defeated the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union might just defeat you because they've inserted into your universities, into your system, into the international organizations that uphold the post-World War II order, from the United Nations to the International Court of Justice, they have inserted the one virus that has proven itself guaranteed to drive societies mad. Now, it's a powerful virus. Someone recently compared it to the ring in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. It's incredibly powerful. Anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism is very powerful because it taps into centuries and millennia of dangerous ideas that allow people to build power, right? Tiny Qatar is using it to build a lot of power. But like the ring, it ultimately destroys its wearer. I'm concerned about the interim, that until Qatar is destroyed, until the Iranian mullah regime is destroyed, my concern is how much damage will they do to the Jewish people before they are destroyed by the ring of anti-Zionism and of anti-Semitism. That's my concern for the moment.
The Iranian case is an interesting one because before the fall of the Shah, before 1979, the Iranian society was actually very pro-Israeli, and the Iranian diaspora and the democratic opposition and the monarchist opposition proves that they are generally very friendly towards Jews, very friendly towards Israel. What is the role that the mullahs and the Ayatollah is playing in the region, and how big of a danger do you think that the Iranian regime is to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel?
So over the years, when I was asked about Iran, I would always say that I'm no expert on Iran, but I am very much an expert on who supported the Palestinians for the last century. Because the Palestinian goal has only ever been one, complete resistance to Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land, what they always were able to do is to draw on the support of every anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist power in the last century. So in the 30s and 40s, they enjoyed the support of the Nazis. They have complete collaboration with them. Today, this is a very inconvenient fact, so people like to pretend that the Mufti, the leader of the Palestinians, and Hitler just had lunch once. But it was a full collaboration with the same values and the same ideology. And in many ways, we're still suffering from the fact that post-World War II, the Arabs were given a free pass from the process of accepting defeat and going through denazification. But when the Nazis are defeated, they are replaced by the Pan-Arabists. And like I said, the Pan-Arabists turned Palestinians into the secular theology of what it means to be a proud Arab and Muslim. And the consequences of that are no Jews from Morocco to Afghanistan. And then the Pan-Arabists are defeated and they're replaced with the Soviets. And the Soviets take anti-Zionism global. I sometimes joke that Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union don't get enough credit for taking Jew hatred global, for inserting it into the institutions from the United Nations to the academia where it flourishes in the West today. And then the Soviet Union is defeated, and the Ayatollah Mullah regime of Iran ultimately becomes the new sponsor of the Palestinian war against Jewish sovereignty. So the good news in all of that is that with a fairly high level of certainty, I can say that the Mullah and Ayatollah regime will find itself defeated in a hot or cold war, and in the same dustbin of history as its predecessors, the Nazis, the Pan-Arabists, and the Soviets. The bad news, the thing that concerns me, is on the way to the dustbin of history, on the way to being defeated, they cause a lot of damage to the Jews, which is my immediate concern, and to the world at large. And my question is, where are we at this moment? Has much of the damage already been done? Are we just in the beginning of the kind of damage and global mayhem that they can do? But again, in terms of a long-term vision, I have no doubt that once the Ayatollah and Mullah regime falls, the people of Iran will once again be our best friends.
You were a Labor politician, and it's quite ironic today that the left, which usually is a standard bearer of progressive values and of tolerance, has now become a standard bearer across the Western world of normalizing to some extent anti-Semitism, be it Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party in the UK, or be it the Squad in the Democratic Party in the USA. How is it that these figures of once tolerant parties that were not associated with being against any minority group have now become, in many ways, virulently anti-Semitic and most certainly virulently anti-Zionist?
The mistake we make is looking at the progressive or very extreme left as if it is the liberal left. It's not. It's the classic illiberal left. It's the left of the Soviet Union that literally wrote the book on anti-Semitism, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion with Tsarist Russia, and then replaced it when anti-Semitism became discredited with the more respectable anti-Zionism. That's what's flourishing in the left today. So the idea of an illiberal left has always come together with very strong anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic views. And the danger is that they don't understand what they're participating in. That many of them, I think, genuinely believe that they're fighting for a good cause, that anti-Zionism is really important. And what they're not understanding is that they are parroting old ideas that have been hatched decades ago, if not centuries ago, that are equating Israel and Zionism with every evil known to man, from colonialism to imperialism to white supremacy to Nazism and genocide. So the equation of Israel and Zionism with every evil known to man, from colonialism to imperialism to apartheid, white supremacy, genocide, and Nazism, has always been in the service of imagining a utopia. I've called this process of equating Israel, Zionism, and the Star of David with every evil known to man as the placard strategy, because you see it on placards in anti-Israel demonstrations, but it's also the UN, in academia. You can get a PhD in Zionism as colonialism. And after October 7th, I saw a new placard, which said, "Keep the world clean." And it had the image of a Star of David in a trash bin. And when I saw that placard, I said, bingo. We've reached the logical conclusion of what has been building now for decades, this equating of Israel and Zionism and the Star of David with every evil known to man. And the idea is, and that's one of the most ancient and dangerous ideas, is that there's a clean world out there, a world of utopia. It's not a coincidence that all the evil words are equated with Israel, Zionism, and the Star of David, and all the good words, freedom, equality, justice, and rights, are equated with the anti-Zionism, with the Palestinian identity. So what people are faced with is the notion that there is a clean world out there, a world of justice, equality, freedom, and rights. And the only thing that stands between us in this messy, terrible world and this utopian world is the collective Jew. And the collective Jew, therefore, has to be placed in the trash bin by any means necessary. And this is the most ancient and most dangerous idea, certainly when it comes to the Jewish people, but to the societies who become obsessed with it. And someone recently said that the Palestinian flag is the new red flag. And when I heard that, I thought, oh, that's actually true. That's why you begin to see Queers for Palestine. Palestine is about climate change. Palestine is about fighting capitalism. Palestine is about indigenous movement, because it has become the new red flag of utopia. There is a global utopia. And like in all the historical utopias, there is always what stands between us and salvation, us and a perfect world, is the collective Jew. And that's what we're seeing in the left. It's not the classic liberal left, it's an illiberal left, which has its own very dangerous history.
We've seen this massive normalization. We see it in the West. We see it in mainstream politics. And not just on the left. Obviously, we've been focusing on the left because I think it's much more visible in the West right now, especially with Ilhan Omar, with Rashida Tlaib, with AOC, with Corbyn. How far do you think it will go in Western society? We know about the Arab world. That's something that we know about. We know about the non-aligned countries that, generally speaking, they will side with the Islamists. But in the Western world specifically, how far do you think this can go? As in, do you think this will reach sort of near Hitler levels, or is this going to be, just a sort of mildly unpleasant strain of it?
So over the last few years, I participated in these high-profile debates as to whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And I lost them all because all you need to do is parade a Jew who says, oh, I'm against Zionism. And they're like, look, there's your Jew. He's against Zionism. It's not about Jews. So when I came out of these debates, and they were always very kind of emotional, I said, okay, this is not some theoretical matter. Oh, we're debating this or that. I realized it's an urgent practical matter. So I decided to research what happens to countries, societies, political parties that turn anti-Zionism into their governing ideology. And here the historical record is clear with no exceptions. Wherever anti-Zionism rises to become the ideology of a place, two things happen. Step one, the environment turns hostile to Jewish life. Even when they say, we have nothing against Jews, we love Jews, Jews are great, even Jews might be at the forefront of some of these movements, the environment turns hostile to Jewish life. And if this is not fought against and stopped, at the end, no Jews are left. Now, when I say no Jews are left, it doesn't necessarily mean the crematorium. As I said, in the Arab world, from Morocco to Afghanistan, the Jews were ethnically cleansed when anti-Zionism became the central ideology of the Arab and Muslim world. But the difference between the Arab world in the 50s and Europe in the 30s is the existence of the State of Israel. So this time, the Jews of the Arab and Muslim world actually had a place that wanted them, had a place to go. You can see this repeating itself in Venezuela, in Poland in '68, whatever remaining Jews were in Poland after World War II who believed in this communist, socialist brotherhood utopia. A wave of anti-Zionism in 1968 basically removed all the Jews from Poland. Many of them committed suicide, by the way. So you have it again and again. You see it in Corbyn's Labor Party. Corbyn genuinely thinks he's not anti-Semitic. He's your classic Soviet anti-Zionist, I just want utopia. But yet, despite his claim that he has nothing against Jews and he's not anti-Semitic, within hours of becoming the chair of the Labor Party became a cesspool of Jew hatred, and Jewish members of parliament from the Labor Party felt that they had to leave. So it always works the same way. Now, the question is the West doomed in that sense to that scenario? And there are 4 places right now where the future of this will be determined: Canada, US, France, and Britain. This is where Jews live outside of Israel. In all these places, we see the rise of anti-Zionism to be a respectable structural idea. The one reason for hope that I have about Jewish life in those countries is that each one of those countries also has a very good history of philo-Semitism, of supporting Jews. So for example, during the Dreyfus affair in France, a lot of people forget that France was split. There were many French people who rallied to support Dreyfus, to go against the betrayal that was against Dreyfus, so France was split. Britain has a long history of philo-Semitism. Canada has the French and British history, and America has a long strain and history of philo-Semitism. So my question is, for those 4 countries, will enough people, non-Jews, at the end of the day, Jews cannot fight this alone, we're a small people, will enough Jews in Britain, Canada, France, and the US rise up to say, we're sorry, this is not Canada, this is not the US, this is not France, this is not Britain. We're not going to allow these ideas to dominate our society. That's the only way that it can get pushed back.
There's an overrepresentation of Jews. In the US, for example, today we're looking at 63% of American Jews are voting for Kamala Harris, and by extension for looser borders, for more liberal policies. There is, in a way, is there a case to be made that very liberal Jews living in the West that are pushing and helping elect very liberal officials who've aligned themselves with these certain forces are acting in their own, not in their own interest, but against their own interests?
So there was an old joke about how Jews vote in the United States, that they make money like Episcopalians, but they vote like Puerto Ricans. And that was always kind of the paradox of Jewish voting for Democrats, despite being successful and supposedly having the interests of wealthy Republicans. And the answer to that was very simple. The Jews were actually buying an insurance policy. What does it mean? It means that Jews knew that when societies are in crisis, when societies collapse, they are often the first scapegoat, right? We talked about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism being the mark of failed societies, of societies in crisis that are trying to blame someone else for their problems. So Jews have very internalized the idea that it's important for societies not to collapse. So historically, they support healthcare, welfare, policies that are supposed to stabilize societies. Because in doing so, in their minds, even if it's unconscious, they're buying an insurance policy against the collapse of that society in which they will be the first victims of. The question is some of that changing? Is the Democratic Party more about the illiberal left and less about liberal policies of stabilizing society? And I think what you're seeing from many Jews today is that they're not really sure what their political home is anymore. And that in itself is already pretty scary and dangerous, because the feeling of Jews that they're homeless is the precursor to be politically homeless, is the precursor to be generally homeless. So again, the question is whether both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, whether enough people in both parties will rise up to say, sorry, this is not America, and we're not going to allow these ideas to make it to the mainstream, because it doesn't end well for the Jewish people and it doesn't end well for the society at large.
You've talked a lot about Jews being a minority in Western societies.
Everywhere.
And, well, they're not a minority in the state of Israel.
Right. Yeah, we're desperately trying to preserve that, yes.
Well, actually, this is a very, perhaps more interesting question. It's a question of demographics. Western demographics are absolutely awful. No Western society, except for Israel, is at above replacement level rates. Why do you think that is?
The Jewish people, in English there's a lot of names: people, nation, tribe, collective. But in Hebrew, there's only two letters that say Am Yisrael. And it's a category and it's a notion that predates the modern notions of nation and people. So in that sense, the Jews are both Western, but of the ancient world. We are modern, but we're still a tribe. So a lot of the paradoxes that you will see in Jewish life have to do with the fact that we're not only Western, we're not only modern, we're also ancient, we're also tribal. We belong both to the old world and to the new world. So as a tribal society, we still have this notion of family, children, and then we combine it with modern living. So Israel, for example, is like there's almost nowhere in the world where you have such a preponderance of mothers of 3 kids and more who have careers, PhDs. This is something that is both ancient and modern.
The world is now very firmly on the Palestinian side. Public opinion is, I think even people who were initially on the Israeli side are very tired. There's a sense of boredom, I think, if you look at it very objectively, very unemotionally, if you separate yourself from the conflict. I do think that this is how most people look at it. They're tired, they've seen too many photos of destruction, they've seen too much Pallywood, real or not. They've seen a lot of suffering of Palestinian people, of Arabs in Gaza, and they've sort of had enough. What do you think is the future that's coming? Not just to Gaza, but just also to the West Bank and just generally to the Palestinian minority that has been raised up and has become this sort of martyr at the altar of public opinion.
If they seem to have enough, we've certainly had enough. We have been fighting, sacrificing for a century because the Palestinians, the Arabs here, are devoted to our non-existence, to the fact that we will not have a state. So we would love for it all to be over. The problem is that just like the Iranian regime says death to Israel, that's not a negotiable demand, right? It's not something that we can exactly negotiate. Unfortunately, that's still the Palestinian demand. Death to Israel. They've learned to say it in words like justice and rights, but fundamentally, if you ask them, are you willing to accept that the Jewish people as a people have a historical connection to this land, that they have the equal right, not exclusive, not superior, the equal right to have their own state, to self-determination in part of the land? You will not find Palestinians who say yes to that. I, over 20 years, have found 3 Palestinians who are publicly willing to say that they want to live next to the Jewish state with all the implications that there's not refugees, that there's no right of return. 3. But other than that, this is not an Israel-Hamas war. Hamas is merely the representative and the executor of the Palestinian vision of no Jewish state. So if they're exhausted, we're exhausted because we're living it. We've been living it for a century. We just want to be sovereign in our ancient homeland. We're happy to live next to an Arab-Palestinian state, going back for a century. Every time that there was a proposal for 2 states, the Jews said yes, as long as one of the 2 is for the Jews. And the Arabs have always said no and went to brutal and violent war if one of the 2 states is for Jews. And that has to end. So if people talk about the day after in Gaza and what will be the future, my answer is very simple. The Gazans, the Palestinians, have to end their century-long war with Zionism. They have to end this destructive idea that there should be no Jewish sovereignty anywhere between the river and the sea, and they need to develop a constructive idea of living next to a Jewish state rather than instead of it. We would love nothing more, but as long as their ideology is from the river to the sea, no Jewish state, that's not something that we can negotiate. That means that we always have to fight, and we will dearly love to stop fighting. But as long as the ideology is various versions of death to Israel, that doesn't leave us much choice but to fight.
Einat Wilf, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.